the last thing he refused to sell. Rain drummed against the corrugated metal roof hard enough to drown out thought. Owen Mercer stood alone in the center of the garage, staring at a yellow envelope lying on his workbench. The envelope contained exactly $73. Not a check, not a promise, just cash. The last money he had left. Water leaked through a crack near the back wall, dripping steadily into a rusted bucket. The sound echoed through the empty building. Drip, drip, drip. A year earlier, the garage had never been quiet. There had always been engines running, impact wrenches rattling, customers arguing about repair bills, delivery trucks pulling in and out. Now, there was only the rain. Owen picked up the envelope and slid it into a drawer. He closed it carefully, as if the amount inside were somehow worth protecting. The gesture made him laugh under his breath. $73, 48 years old, and that was what remained. A knock came from the open bay door. Still here? The voice belonged to Danny Russo. Danny had worked at the paper mill for nearly 30 years before it shut down. These days he repaired farm equipment when he could find the work. Owen glanced up. Where else would I be? Danny stepped inside, shaking rain from his jacket. The garage smelled of oil, steel, and damp concrete. His eyes moved around the room. The empty shelves, the silent lifts, the unopened stack of overdue notices near the office door. You eat today? Danny asked. Owen ignored the question. Danny sighed. That's a no. I'm fine. You look terrible. Thanks. Danny walked toward the coffee machine in the corner. It hadn't worked properly in years. Neither man mentioned it. They both knew there wasn't any coffee anyway. For a moment, they listened to the rain. Then Danny said what everyone had been saying for months. You should sell it. Owen stared at the floor. There it was, again. The advice, the logic, the practical solution. Sell the garage, pay off the debt, start over somewhere else. Maybe find work at one of the distribution centers outside town. Maybe rent a small apartment. Maybe stop carrying the weight of a dying business. It all sounded reasonable. Yet every time someone suggested it, something tightened inside him. I can't. Danny rubbed the back of his neck. Why? Owen opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because he didn't know how to explain it. The garage wasn't just a building. His father had worked here. Before him, his grandfather had repaired tractors in the same location when the road outside was still gravel. Every scratch on the workbench carried a memory. Every stain on the concrete belonged to a different decade. Selling it felt like erasing something. And lately, too much had already disappeared. The question landed harder than Owen expected. No. Nothing? No. Danny nodded slowly. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The marriage had ended quietly. No screaming, no dramatic confrontation. Just years of distance growing wider, until one day Claire packed her things and left. Sometimes Owen thought that hurt more. There wasn't a single moment to blame, just 1,000 small ones. The rain continued hammering the roof. Eventually Danny stood. I've got a combine to look at. Owen nodded. At the door, Danny paused. Whatever happens, don't disappear on people. What does that mean? It means you've been acting like a man waiting for something to finish him. Danny offered a small wave and stepped back into the storm. The sound of his truck faded down the road. Silence returned. Owen remained where he was, waiting, thinking, listening to the building breathe around him. Hours passed. The gray afternoon slowly darkened. Finally, he grabbed a flashlight. If he couldn't sleep, he could at least clean. The rear storage area had become a graveyard of forgotten equipment. Old welding tanks, broken compressors, dust-covered tool cabinets, boxes nobody had opened in years. The flashlight beam swept across the clutter. Near the back wall sat a steel cabinet coated in rust, his father's cabinet. Owen hadn't touched it since the funeral, 8 years earlier. For a moment he considered walking away. Instead, he pulled open the door. The hinges screamed. Inside were scattered tools, faded photographs, and several metal binders covered in dust. Curious, he lifted one onto a workbench. A cloud of dust drifted upward. The cover contained no label, just worn steel. He opened it. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, sketches, measurements, engineering calculations, some dated nearly 30 years earlier. Owen frowned. His father had always carried notebooks, but he had assumed they contained ordinary repair records. These were different, very different. The drawings showed machine assemblies, industrial components, rotating systems, mechanical designs he didn't immediately recognize. He turned another page and another. The notes became more detailed, pages filled with observations, failure reports, redesigned parts, handwritten theories. It wasn't random tinkering. It was research. Years of it. The deeper he read, the more confused he became. A sentence near the bottom of one page caught his eye. Downtime is the real expense. Nobody is solving the right problem. Owen read it twice, then 3 times. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Inside the garage, the leaking bucket continued its steady rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. He reached for the second binder, then the third. The storm outside faded from his awareness. Hours slipped by unnoticed. For the first time in months, something had replaced the numbness. Not hope, not yet. Something else. Curiosity. And buried beneath that curiosity was a question he couldn't stop thinking about. If his father had spent decades working on this, why had he hidden it? And what exactly had he been trying to build? The men who started showing up after dark. 3 months later, the garage no longer felt abandoned. It still looked rough. The roof still leaked during heavy rain. The office heater still made a grinding noise every time it started. The old sign outside still hung slightly crooked. But something had changed. The silence was gone. On a humid July evening, Owen stood beside a workbench covered in metal shavings and blueprints. A small industrial assembly sat clamped in a testing frame. It wasn't pretty. The steel housing carried scratches from repeated modifications. The welds weren't showroom quality. Several sections had clearly been rebuilt more than once. But appearance wasn't the point. Performance was. Owen checked the gauges one final time, then flipped the switch. The test motor came alive. The machine began turning, slowly at first, then faster. The bearing temperatures remained stable. Vibration levels stayed low. A full 20 minutes passed, then 30. Owen stared at the monitor readings, still steady. A grin threatened to appear. He fought it. The machine had fooled him before. At minute 43, he heard footsteps behind him. Still running? Owen turned. Danny stood in the doorway carrying 2 coffees. 43 minutes, Owen said. Danny handed him a cup. You're keeping track? I've got 6 months of failures memorized. Danny laughed. Fair point. Both men watched the machine. Minute 44, 45, 46. No alarms, no overheating, no unusual vibration. Nothing. The assembly simply kept working. Danny took a sip of coffee. You know, normal people celebrate when things work. Owen crossed his arms. It hasn't failed yet. That's called working. Not long enough. Danny shook his head. You've become exactly like your father. The comment lingered in the air. Months earlier it would have bothered Owen. Now it felt different. Not because he suddenly understood his father completely, but because he finally understood what had driven him. The notebooks had revealed years of frustration, hundreds of failed attempts, dozens of redesigns. Most people would have quit. His father hadn't, and somewhere along the way, neither had Owen. The machine reached 1 hour, still running. Neither man spoke. Eventually Danny broke the silence. Tell me something. What? When was the last time you thought about selling the garage? Owen looked around. The stained concrete floor, the racks of tools, the shelves lined with prototypes, the stacks of engineering notes. I don't remember. Danny smiled. Good. A pickup truck pulled into the parking lot outside. Then another. Owen frowned. You expecting someone? No. The first truck door opened. A man climbed out. Then another. Then a third. Owen, former maintenance supervisor. After him, Pete Lawson, toolmaker, retired. The 3 men entered the garage carrying folding chairs. Owen blinked. What are you doing? Harold set down his chair. Watching. Watching what? The test. Owen looked confused. Victor shrugged. Word gets around. What word? The fact that you're building something interesting. Owen stared at them. None of the men appeared interested in joking. Pete unfolded his chair. We heard the new version might actually work. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Danny burst out laughing. The others joined him. Even Owen couldn't stop a reluctant smile. By the end of the evening, 6 men sat inside the garage, watching test data as if they were attending a championship game. When the machine finally completed its cycle without failure, the celebration was surprisingly quiet. No cheering, no shouting, just nods, satisfied smiles, a few firm handshakes. Not words. As the others prepared to leave, Harold lingered. "You know what you've got here?" Owen shook his head. "A chance." "At what?" Harold looked around the garage. "To build something people stopped believing was possible." Then he walked out. The statement stayed with Owen long after everyone left. The following weeks became a blur. Orders arrived slowly, then steadily. A paper mill purchased 5 units, a packaging company ordered 12, a food processing plant requested a trial installation. Nothing huge, but enough. Enough to keep the lights on, enough to buy materials, enough to imagine a future beyond survival. One afternoon, a black SUV pulled into the lot. The vehicle looked out of place among pickup trucks and service vans. A man in an expensive suit stepped out. His name was Richard Bellamy, Regional Acquisitions Manager, a title Owen immediately distrusted. Bellamy toured the garage with polite interest. He asked questions, examined prototypes, reviewed performance reports. Then he made an offer. A large one, far larger than Owen expected. Bellamy wanted the design. All of it, patent rights included. The amount would erase every debt Owen had, several times over. That night, the paperwork sat unopened on his desk. The numbers were tempting, life-changing even. For the first time in months, uncertainty returned. The following evening, Harold arrived. Then Victor, then Pete. Soon 6 chairs surrounded the workbench again. Nobody mentioned the contract at first. Eventually, Owen slid the paperwork across the table. The men studied it, page after page. Silence filled the room. Finally, Victor frowned. "What?" Victor tapped a paragraph. "This clause." Owen leaned forward. "What about it?" Harold adjusted his glasses. A few minutes later, his expression darkened. "Oh. What?" Harold looked up. "They're not buying it to develop it." The garage grew quiet. Owen felt his stomach tighten. "What are you talking about?" Victor pointed to another section. Maintenance exemptions. Then another. Market protection provisions. Then another. Competitive restrictions. Slowly, the pieces came together. The realization settled heavily over the room. Bellamy's company didn't want the invention because it threatened competitors. They wanted it because it threatened them. Buying it would allow them to bury it, control it, limit it, maybe even eliminate it. Pete folded the contract closed. Seen this before. Owen stared at the paperwork. Months ago, he might have signed immediately. Desperation would have made the decision easy. Now it wasn't, because the garage no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to everyone who had started showing up after dark. The retired workers, the apprentices, the people who still believed things could be built at the worn faces, the calloused hands, the people who had quietly chosen to believe in him before success arrived. Then he reached for the contract and tore it in half. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. Harold simply nodded once, as if confirming something he'd suspected all along. Later that night, after everyone left, Owen locked up the garage. When he checked his phone, a new message waited. The sender's name froze him in place. Claire, his ex-wife. The message contained only one sentence. "I heard what you've been building. Can we talk?" The price of something money can't buy. The message sat on Owen's phone for nearly 2 days before he answered it. Not because he didn't know what to say, because he wasn't sure what he felt. For months, Claire had existed only as a memory, a voice that no longer echoed through the garage office, a coffee mug that still sat untouched on a shelf, a habit of turning toward an empty side of the bed. Now, suddenly, she was real again, and she wanted something. That part was impossible to ignore. On the 3rd morning, Owen finally replied, "Saturday, noon, Miller's Diner." Nothing more, nothing less. The diner stood on the edge of town, beside an old railway crossing. The kind of place where the booths had been repaired so many times, nobody remembered their original color. When Owen arrived, Claire was already there. She looked different, not dramatically, just older, the way everyone looked after a difficult year. She sat near the window, staring into a cup of coffee. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was unfamiliar, like meeting someone you once knew better than yourself. "Hi," Claire said softly. "Hi." A waitress appeared. Owen ordered coffee. The waitress left. The silence returned. Finally, Claire folded her hands together. I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't. She nodded. Fair. Outside, a freight train moved slowly across the crossing. The sound filled the space between them. Claire waited until it passed. Then she took a breath. I heard about the company. Owen smiled faintly. Everyone has. It's impressive. That's one word for it. Another silence. Claire looked down. I'll get straight to the point. Probably best. She nodded. I want to invest. There it was. The reason. No dramatic reunion. No attempt to repair the marriage. Business. Owen leaned back in the booth. Why? Claire met his eyes. Because I think it's going to become something important. He almost laughed. Instead, he stirred his coffee. Interesting timing. The words weren't angry, but they carried enough weight. Claire heard it. I know. Do you? Yes. The honesty surprised him. No excuses, no defensiveness. Just acknowledgement. Outside, sunlight reflected off passing cars. Inside, the old diner remained quiet. Finally, Owen asked the question he had spent months avoiding. Why did you leave? Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared out the window. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. Do you really want to know? Yes. The answer came quicker than he expected. Claire nodded slowly. Okay. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. As strange as this sounds, I never left because you failed. Owen frowned. What? I didn't leave because the business struggled. Then why? Claire searched for the words. The pause felt genuine, painfully genuine. I left because you stopped believing in yourself. The statement landed harder than any accusation could have. Owen looked away. Claire continued. For years, I watched you solve problems nobody else could solve. You make that sound impressive. It was. You never said that. I did. He thought about arguing, then stopped. Maybe she had. Maybe he simply hadn't listened. Claire's eyes softened. Every time you had an idea, you'd talk yourself out of it. Owen remained silent. You'd say somebody smarter would figure it out. She paused. Or somebody richer. Or somebody younger. The words felt uncomfortable because they were true. Claire looked toward the window again. I kept waiting for you to take yourself seriously. And when I didn't, I got tired. The honesty hurt. Not because it was cruel, because it wasn't. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only regret. For several moments, neither spoke. The years between them seemed to settle quietly onto the table. Finally, Owen asked, So that's it? No. Claire shook her head. No, that's not all of it. She smiled sadly. We both made mistakes. The statement felt equally true. Marriage wasn't a machine with one broken part. It was thousands of moving pieces, and sometimes people failed to notice the damage until too much had worn away. The waitress refilled their coffee. Neither touched it. Claire eventually slid a folder across the table. Inside were investment documents. Professional, straightforward. No tricks, no pressure. I'd like the opportunity to buy shares. Owen studied the paperwork, then closed it. You know something strange? What? A year ago, I would have sold everything. Claire nodded. I know. I would have taken the first offer. I know that too. He looked toward the window. The railway tracks stretched toward the horizon, old steel disappearing into distance. When you left, I thought losing you was the worst thing that happened. Claire remained quiet. Now he understood something he hadn't before. The worst thing had happened much earlier, years earlier, when he'd stopped trusting his own ability, when he'd convinced himself that survival was enough, when he'd slowly buried every ambition beneath routine. Claire hadn't created that problem. She had simply stopped waiting for him to fix it. Eventually, Owen stood. So what's your answer? She asked. He considered the question carefully, not because he needed time, because he wanted to be honest. The answer wasn't about money, or revenge, or proving a point. It was about who he had become. A year ago, resentment might have decided for him. Today, it didn't. You can buy shares. Claire blinked. Really? Owen nodded. A small amount. Relief crossed her face. Not triumph. Relief. The distinction mattered. Thank you. He smiled. Don't thank me yet. She laughed quietly. For the first time all afternoon, the tension eased. Months passed, then more. The company expanded steadily, not explosively, Not overnight, the way real things grow. One customer at a time, one contract at a time, one problem solved after another. The old garage remained the heart of everything. New facilities were built elsewhere, but the original building stayed, exactly where it had always been. One autumn morning, a young apprentice named Ethan stood beside Owen before sunrise. Workers were beginning to arrive. Headlights swept across the parking lot. Inside the garage, lights flickered on one by one. The familiar sounds returned. Machines, conversation, life. Ethan looked at the aging building. "I've always wondered something." "What's that?" "Why didn't you tear this place down?" Owen glanced toward the rusted roof, the patched walls, the weathered sign hanging above the entrance. For a moment he thought about the answer, about his father, about failure, about second chances, about all the people who had refused to quit. Then he smiled. The best things here weren't built from new parts. Ethan looked confused. Owen simply pointed toward the garage, toward the workers entering through the old doors, toward the building everyone once called worthless. The apprentice followed his gaze. Slowly, understanding appeared. Not complete understanding, but enough. The sun began rising behind the factory roofs. Golden light spread across the town, across the garage, across the people who filled it. And as Owen watched them arrive, he realized something money could never buy. The company wasn't his greatest achievement. The patents weren't. The contracts weren't. Not even the success itself. It was the fact that a place everyone had given up on had become a place people believed in again. Just like the man who refused to leave it. And in the quiet light of morning, that felt like enough. The notebook he never opened. Winter returned to the valley almost exactly 1 year after the first successful prototype left Owen's garage. Snow drifted across the empty railroad tracks behind the property. The old building looked smaller now, not because it had changed, because everything around it had grown. The company employed 42 people. 3 nearby factories used Owen's technology. Orders arrived from states he had never visited. Investors called weekly. Industry magazines requested interviews. A regional business award sat untouched on a shelf in the office. Most days, Owen forgot it existed. On a cold Thursday evening, he locked the main workshop after everyone had gone home. The familiar sounds of the day had faded. No machinery, no conversation, no forklifts, only silence. The kind of silence he used to fear. Now it felt different, peaceful. He walked toward the storage room at the rear of the building, the same room where he had discovered his father's notebooks nearly 2 years earlier. Most of the shelves had been cleaned and reorganized, but one corner remained untouched. An old metal locker stood against the wall. He had noticed it dozens of times, yet somehow never opened it. Tonight he did. The lock resisted, then gave way with a metallic snap. Inside sat a cardboard box covered in dust. Nothing remarkable, no hidden treasure, no dramatic discovery, just a box. Owen carried it to the workbench. Inside were photographs, receipts, old manuals, a few letters. Then he found a notebook. Unlike the others, this one wasn't filled with engineering sketches. There were no calculations, no diagrams, no prototypes, only writing, his father's handwriting. Owen sat down. Slowly he opened the first page. For several minutes, the garage disappeared around him. The notebook wasn't a technical journal. It was something much more personal. Scattered entries written across decades, thoughts, observations, regrets, small moments recorded after long work days. The earliest entries described struggles Owen had never known about. Financial problems, failed contracts, equipment breakdowns, months when the business nearly collapsed. The surprises kept coming. His father had been afraid, constantly. Afraid of losing the garage, afraid of disappointing his family, afraid of making mistakes. Afraid he wasn't good enough. Owen stopped reading. For years he had remembered his father as unshakable, a man who always seemed to know what to do. The notebook revealed someone entirely different, someone human, someone uncertain, someone flawed, much like himself. He continued turning pages. The entries moved through the years. Some were only a few sentences, others stretched across multiple pages. Then one particular entry caught his attention. The date sat in the upper corner. 23 years earlier, Owen would have been 25. The entry began with a single sentence. Today, Owen fixed a problem I couldn't solve. He smiled despite himself. He barely remembered the incident. A malfunctioning hydraulic system. A lucky observation. Nothing special. Yet his father had written 3 full pages about it, not about the repair, about watching his son become better than he had been at the same age. Owen read the passage twice. Then again. His throat tightened unexpectedly. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the workshop remained still. Page after page revealed things his father had never spoken aloud. Admiration, respect, concern, love. The quiet kind many working men carried but struggled to express. Near the end of the notebook, the handwriting became shakier, the entries shorter. His father's health had clearly begun failing. Then Owen reached the final written page. There were only 2 paragraphs. He read them slowly, then sat motionless. The first paragraph discussed the unfinished project, the invention, the idea that eventually changed everything. The second paragraph was different, personal, direct, almost as if it had been written specifically for whoever found it. If this ever works, I hope it isn't because of me. Owen frowned. He continued reading. I hope somebody improves it, makes it better, changes what I got wrong. Otherwise it means they were only following instructions. A long pause, then the final sentence. The goal was never to leave behind a design. The goal was to leave behind people who could build something better. The words settled heavily in the quiet garage. For a long time, Owen simply stared at the page. His entire journey suddenly looked different. The company, the patents, the success, even the invention itself. None of it had really been about preserving the past. It had been about continuing it, improving it, moving beyond it. His father had understood that long before he did. The realization stayed with him for weeks, then months, and eventually influenced a decision that surprised everyone, including his investors, including Claire, including the board of directors. The following spring, Owen announced a new apprenticeship program. Not for college graduates, not for executives, not for engineers with impressive resumes, for mechanics, machine operators, toolmakers, factory workers, people whose talents were often overlooked, the same kinds of people who had helped build the company from the beginning. The first class contained 12 apprentices. By the second year, there were 30. Some arrived with experience. Others arrived carrying self-doubt. Many reminded Owen of himself. One afternoon, while walking through the workshop, he watched a young apprentice solve a design problem that had frustrated senior technicians for days. The solution was simple, elegant, unexpected. Several employees gathered around the prototype, discussing possibilities, making improvements, building on the idea. Owen stood quietly in the background, watching, smiling. And for a brief moment he understood exactly how his father must have felt. Not pride in an invention, not pride in a company, pride in people. As the sun set behind the old garage, Owen locked the front door and looked back one final time before heading home. The building was no longer the most valuable thing on the property. Far from it. But it remained the most important. Because everything that followed had started there. With $73, a leaking roof, a forgotten notebook, and one man who refused to sell the last thing that still believed in him. The lights inside the garage glowed warmly against the approaching dusk. And for the first time in many years, Owen felt no urgency to prove himself. No need to chase validation. No need to measure success. The work would continue. Others would improve it. Others would carry it forward. That was enough. Maybe it had always been enough.